start by apologising because this is actually Lucy Ballou's project, but unfortunately due to unforeseen circumstances she couldn't be here today. So I will be presenting. However, I did not take part in this study. So if you have any questions, I do encourage you to email her. I'm going to give you her email address at the end. So this project was actually financed by the association Vivre et Devenir in the goal to develop an assessment tool for depressive disorders specific to children and adolescents on the autism spectrum. So Kanner was the first to describe a momentary fit of depression in one of his cases in association with autism. Yet, in 2019, we still don't know how to diagnose this comorbidity. And this is particularly highlighted in the literature because depending on what studies we look at, there can be a prevalence of 0% of depression among children and adolescents with autism. And then in other studies, they're going to say there's 83% prevalence. So the goal of this PhD project was to create and validate a scale for screening major depressive disorder among children and adolescents on the autism spectrum. This was done by following a classic method for creating a screening tool. So first of all, there was a systematic review of the literature. And what was found were criteria that we find also in the DSM-5 that were found as well among children and adolescents on the autism spectrum. So first was depressed mood or irritable mood, markedly diminished interest or pleasure, significant changes in weight or appetite, insomnia or hypersomnia, psychomotor agitation or more slowing down, fatigue or loss of energy, feelings of worthlessness or excessive or inappropriate guilt, diminished ability to think or concentrate or indecisiveness, recurrent thoughts of death. And then there was criteria that was found among the literature that was more specific to children and adolescents on the autism spectrum. So this was aggressiveness, lability of mood, regression of acquired skills, lack of self-care, and variation of autistic symptomatology. There were certain recommendations that were given by authors in the literature. So the first of all was to eliminate any other causes of behavioural change, for example, pain, to conduct assessments of physiological and behavioural changes in order to understand how the behaviours are expressed among children and adolescents on the autism spectrum, and avoid errors due to overlapping of symptoms. So this would be avoided by creating a baseline of behaviours. What was found that there was actually 2 tools specific to analysing depressive disorders among children and adolescents on the autism spectrum. So the revised Children's Anxiety and Depression Scale and also the Autism Comorbid Interview. However, these tools have seldomly been used since the publication of DSM-5, and the authors are still concluding that there needs to be another tool that's created, as this was generally tested among children and adolescents with autism that didn't have an intellectual disability. Other tools used in the literature to assess depressive disorders are tools that were created for neurotypical children that have not actually been adapted, or generally are not adapted in the literature, to be specific to autism. So after this literature, there was a professional survey that was conducted. So this was to add information to what was found in the literature review, to ensure the involvement of professionals in the field of autism in the design of the scale, and so they knew as well about it for future use, and to adapt vocabulary. So 19 professionals who worked in the field of autism answered 4 open questions about emotional, behavioural and cognitive signs of depressive disorders among children and adolescents on the autism spectrum. What was found were more or less exactly the same criteria, but there's a missing one. I don't know if you noticed what it is. So it's all 8, and 1 is missing. I'm going to tell you in a minute. And also all the specific criteria. And what was missing was actually depressed mood, or even synonyms, so for example, feeling sad, And the hypothesis was given that maybe this was due to maybe a specific expression of depression among children and adolescents with autism, or maybe a lack of knowledge and beliefs from the part of professionals. Then a first version of the scale was created. This was created and it was divided into 3 parts. So first there was a behaviour baseline section, then a pain assessment section, and then a depressive symptomatology assessed by observing changes over time, so the magnitude of change over time. After this, there was an evaluation of the quality of the scale. So this was to ensure content and face validity and improve the first version of the scale. So this was done by 15 experts in the field of autism who assessed the utility, the clarity, and the quality of each item and section. They were given open questions on how it would be possible to improve the scale. For example, does the scale seem to measure major depressive disorders in children and adolescents on the autism spectrum? Which professionals could complete this scale? All professionals believed that the 3-part scale format was adapted, was good. However, the baseline section wasn't fully comprehensible for 13%, but it was deemed essential by 70%. The pain assessment was deemed as being an important part of the scale. However, it was thought to be too complicated. And the need to add a part assessing environmental changes was suggested by the experts. 100% deemed all of the items useful and relevant, so there was no need to exclude any items or add any items. And the modalities of answering were deemed very good. So then there was a second version of the scale that was created. So we can see that the first part then became pain assessment. This was simplified and made shorter. Then there was a second part that was added for environmental changes. And then the third part that assesses depressive symptomatology, assessed as magnitude of change observed, so changes over time. Basically, in front of each item, there was a guide that was added in order to have a behaviour baseline and for it to be easier to see the extent of behavioural changes over time. Then there was a feasibility study conducted with parents. This was to judge the level of understanding of the items, to identify patterns in answering, so the path parents took to answer the questions, to assess the acceptability of the scale, and to estimate the time needed to complete it. So these were done by interviews with 20 parents of children on the autism spectrum, and so the number of items that were misunderstood or refused to answer were also counted. So there was a concordance between the guides, so that's the behavioural baseline, so between the guide of usual child behaviour and the extent of behavioural changes observed. There was also an understanding of each item and the vocabulary used, and all parents agreed to answer all of the questions in an average of 37 minutes. So then this scale was then submitted to a validation study in order to ensure the psychometric qualities of the scale. So first off, there was a content validity was tested. So this is established by the literature review, the professional survey, and the assessment by the expert group. Then the structure validity by an exploratory factor analysis. Then criteria validity by comparing the results of the scale with a psychiatrist's clinical diagnosis. Then internal validity by calculating Cronbach's alpha. And then the inter-rater reliability by correlating the scores of parents and professionals. So this was done, and basically the parents completed the scales for 153 children, aged between 3 and 17 years of age. 26% with girls and 74% with boys. Just above 30% of these children were deemed to be dependent, totally dependent, and 65% had access to language. So the content validity was ensured by the literature review, the professional survey, and the expert's assessment of the quality of the scale, which was deemed very satisfactory. The exploratory factor analysis revealed 2 factors. So the first factor of behavioural changes, and the second factor of cognitive and emotional changes. So we can see here how the factors are distributed. However, the uniqueness index needs to be under 0.6 in order for it to contribute fully to the scale. So every item above 0.6 that's in bold was deleted from the scale, apart from suicidal thoughts, as it is on the symptomology of the DSM-5. So then another factor analysis was conducted, and we found the same two factors again. However, we can see here that the two factors are distributed differently between, the items are distributed differently between the factors. There was a strong and positive and significant correlation with the assessment by the psychiatrist, which confirmed the criteria validity, and the internal validity was excellent, which means that the scale assesses a single dimension, which was what was hoped. And the inter-rater reliability was also very satisfactory. So this scale has very satisfactory psychometric qualities. It needs to be replicated with a larger number of people or children and adolescents on the autism spectrum in order to conduct a confirmatory factor analysis. And of course, it's necessary to add an auto-evaluative section to the scale in order to include the children and adolescents on the autism spectrum in the evaluation. And this scale is important because it will improve the care of children and adolescents on the autism spectrum, especially by avoiding false negatives or false positives when diagnosing depressive disorders among children and adolescents on the autism spectrum. Thank you very much. So if you've got any questions, please ask Lucy below by email.